Hi there and welcome. I never really expected to be headlining a video on the insulin cases ever again. Over the course of more than 20 videos on the case, I have had a lot to say on them, comfortably more than on any of the other claimed attack methods. Everything I have previously said in relation to those insulin cases, however, has been premised on a misinformation regarding a pivotal aspect of their role in Miss Letby's conviction. This was naturally of some concern, although a more measured assessment of the impact would suggest that only one of my previous offerings is seriously compromised, the one titled Miss Letby, How the Defense Went from Being Part of the Solution to Being Part of the Problem. Ironically, the excessively long, deep dive into the Child F case is totally unaffected, as its focus was the Nostradamus-like power to see into the future that the prosecution case implied to Miss Letby, and my argument that it was a gateway case in a more sinister and disturbing sense than the female detective had said in that Panorama program. At the time, I accepted the plain inference from her words that in the 9 months up to February 2018, Operation Hummingbird had been becalmed, with police suspicion of criminal activity no greater than when they first entered the hospital. As such, logically, without Brearey's abuse of police ignorance in medical matters to create a Child F case, police would never have felt they had the definitive proof of deliberate harm to babies, which then reasonably justified putting other unexplained collapses down to the insulin poisoner as well. The main thrust of the video was to raise awareness of that unchallengeable logical implication. In mentally reviewing the content of that video to assess the impact on what I had said of the piece of misinformation, I noticed that the natural inference from what that female police officer said in the Panorama program was eerily consistent with the blatant lie with which Johnson KC had begun his opening statement. He told jurors that, having noted Miss Letby as the one common denominator in the collapses, TV doctor Ravi Jayaram and the other consultants had called in the police, who then commissioned a review, which in description can only be the RCPCH one, and the finding of that review was that 2 children had been poisoned by insulin. The 2 statements were almost a year apart, in entirely different contexts, and by 2 people who, though on the same side of the case, are unlikely to have ever spoken or met. Nevertheless, it is as if both are delivering from the same script. We know the first one was a mini psyop, part of the overall psyop to mislead the jurors into convicting an innocent person in the absence of anything pretending to be real evidence, even if secretly fabricated. Can it be safe to blindly trust a later statement which, narrative-wise, is so consistent with the earlier one we know to be a lie? Could the policewoman's statement from late August 2023 not be part of a larger psyop extending beyond the jurors to society, the acceptance by which of the engineered verdict by those jurors is essential for imparting legitimacy, moral force, and therefore the necessary finality to that fraudulent verdict? I am acutely aware that I am in danger of seeking to ride 2 horses here, so, to maximize clarity, I need to park this new question as to whether that female detective and Stephen Brearey were actively misleading the British public when, in that Panorama program of 25th August 2023, the one led us to infer and the other explicitly stated that insulin poisoning was the first attack method identified. I will first deal with that consequential piece of misinformation and the genesis of it, then returned to the question of whether these two were lying to the nation about the sequence of events in the development of Operation Hummingbird. As a brief aside, prompted by the mention of that innocuous sounding but possibly deeply sinister choice of name, I strongly recommend those of you who have not previously done so to visit Callie Starforth's Substack, Essays on the Edge, and read her first offering on the case, dated September 2nd, 2023. She brings a level of erudition to her analysis which is unrivaled, and her brief exploration of the possible significance of the word hummingbird in the name of the psychological operation to engineer the conviction of Miss Letby will chill you to the bone. Basically, there is a very real possibility that the conspiracy goes much higher than even the likes of conspiracy realists like myself have suggested to entities for whom the likes of the corporatocracy-owned British state, previously the limit of my own suspicions, is just another tool and far from their most powerful one. Though the writing is lucid and totally accessible, this is not for the intellectually faint-hearted. If, on the other hand, you are committed to truth and have no fear of it, you cannot afford to not at least hear what the incredibly gifted and truly courageous Callie Starforth says in that post. I myself have only read the first 500 or so words, but will be consuming the remainder as my intellectual treat later this evening. To return to my original thread, the concern which prompted this video was a recognition that, as all future videos will be premised on the corrected state of knowledge on the misinformation, which only happened on the 2nd of April, there would naturally be a tension between past videos and future ones, a tension which could only grow. A further pertinent consideration is that the misinformation was the catalyst and primary basis for my questioning of Ben Myers' integrity in that previously mentioned video about the defense going from being part of the solution to being part of the problem. The misinformation in question is that Ben Myers conceded as an agreed fact, as such not open to being later contested during the trial, that child F and child L were in fact poisoned through the introduction into their bodies of synthetic insulin. As I have mentioned elsewhere, I, along with many of you, I'm sure, got the information in a mid-September 2023 Science on Trial Sunday morning Zoom meeting. In the days and weeks before, Sarrita Adams had posted several papers blowing the insulin convictions out of the water. So there was a sense that Miss Letby's impending appeal application would be something of a walkover, and once the insulin cases fell, others were sure to follow. I, and I imagine every other participant that morning, was then crestfallen when Sarrita Adams gave information that the insulin cases could not in fact form part of any appeal made by Ben Myers, because he had conceded it as considered insulin poisoning as an agreed fact pre-trial. A new defense team could include it in an appeal, but his team couldn't. When 16 months later, in early January of this year, I learned that the insulin cases had been the first verdicts returned by the jury, and in circumstances evidencing a titanic struggle between the pro-guilters in the jury room and others whose intuition told them the truth of the case, I was again reminded of the alleged agreed fact of insulin poisoning. In the circumstances, it looked as though the agreed fact had finally given Miss Letby's defenders no choice but to give in and convict. It therefore followed that no unarguable concession of poisoning, it therefore followed that with no unarguable concession of poisoning, there would have been no insulin convictions. and with no insulin convictions, no other convictions. Benjamin Myers therefore appeared culpable in his client's conviction. Despite that evidence, through confirmation bias, that Ben Myers had indeed conceded insulin poisoning, in the period since January, I encountered a number of little snippets from the trial which were not consistent with the idea of there being no dispute over insulin poisoning. They brought back to mind the slightly puzzling fact that nowhere in the Total Life Child Death report is there a mention of insulin poisoning as an agreed fact. There was also the consideration of why it would have been necessary for hatchetman Johnson KC to bully Miss Letby into a defensive position on insulin poisoning of essentially, "If you say so, but someone else must have administered the synthetic insulin because I didn't." In recent weeks, I have therefore come to strongly suspect that despite the significance to the jury finally convicting Miss Letby, insulin poisoning had in fact been disputed by the defense. So the statement that it was an agreed fact was incorrect. Benjamin Myers' opening statement was inconclusive. He pointed out that Child F's problems had continued after the replacement of the bespoke TPN bag Miss Letby had co-signed for, and that none of Hindmarsh's 3 explanatory scenarios identified Miss Letby as the culprit. If anything, though, the use of a word like culprit supports the thesis that the defense's position was that poisoning had taken place, but Miss Letby wasn't the poisoner. Finally, though, in doing a deep dive on the judge's summing up for a future video, I got conclusive proof that my suspicion was correct from what Goss says in summing up at 10:51 on July 3rd. To quote the report, he, the judge, says the prosecution say the chances of more than one person acting in that way, giving the insulin, is not realistic. He says the defense invite the jury to question the samples and the lack of harm if the babies had been poisoned, but says the prosecution's answer is that the intention was endangering the lives of the babies. End report quote. Then, at 12:53 on July 4th, it is even more clearly stated. I quote, The defense say the proof is on the prosecution, that the jury must be sure that child F and child L received synthetic insulin and that it was Letby who administered that." End quote. There you have it, plain as day. I have no thoughts on how Sarrita Adams came to mislead the Science on Trial community on this. Exploring that question cannot conceivably help Miss Letby's cause, and, in the greater scheme of things, has to be balanced by the fact of Sarrita Adams' Trojan and pioneering work in debunking, to the point of ridicule even for non-scientists, the pseudoscience of that charlatan Evans and his cast of Muppets, on whom taxpayers' money for years of higher education could not have been more wasted. It remains the case that her devastating, meticulously researched posts on the Science on Trial website were only surpassed with the publication of the preliminary report of Professor Shu Lee's Dream Team on 4th February, and after the report remains the most cogent and compelling scientific arguments for a quashing of Miss Letby's convictions or a retrial. If Ben Myers did not concede insulin poisoning as an agreed fact, as we now know definitively that he didn't, then why did Johnson KC start his opening statement with the insulin cases rather than the counts A through to the first 5 cases, and make them, those insulin cases, the centerpiece or hook, establishing that malevolence which he and later Goss told jurors justified them in simply speculating maliciously when unsure as to the prosecution's assertions about Miss Letby's actions or intentions in relation to the other 20 counts. I can only think that in terms of the necessary conditioning of the jurors to a guilty verdict with no basis in fact or evidence, it was the equivalent of the mushy food you give to babies before graduating them onto solids. The solids, in the case of the jurors, being the necessarily unfamiliar, novel concoctions and straight-up medical fabrications of Evans. Had Johnson KC started out talking about air embolisms, some of the jurors are likely to have made a decision to acquit there and then, or just switched off. I now want to pick up that second thread, the question arising from the sense of Johnson KC's opening statement whopper and what the female detective said in the Panorama program being eerily consistent with that obvious lie. As previously stated, the incontrovertible logical inference from what was said on the Panorama program is that this wholly synthesized case, a criminal explanation for the deaths and collapses, only came into existence with Brearey's discovery of the child death insulin result in February 2018. Two people we know to be active participants in a conspiracy are asking us to believe something internally consistent with an earlier utterance in Johnson's opening statement, which we know to be a lie. In such a circumstance, what is more probable? That they too seek to mislead, or that they are giving us gospel truth? I therefore had to ask myself whether or not Brearey's sudden discovery, no change there, still a barefaced lie, of child death's insulin results and the direction to police that those results represent an incontrovertible smoking gun for poisoning, also still a lie, was not in fact a fable constructed long after Evans had come on board in anticipation of and as a solution for the problem a prosecuting counsel would face presenting the main, necessarily undetectable and therefore undisprovable attack methods in an intuitively accessible way to jurors in the future criminal trial. What I am saying is air embolism, etc. were already known as planned attack methods to Brearey in February 2018, but for the purposes of the fable, he needs us to believe that knowledge, to believe that knowledge to be still in his future, that it wasn't known to him at that time. In assessing the mind-bending possibility that what we understand to be Brearey's lies within actual events are actually lies within a bigger lie, a fable necessary to give a fraudulent prosecution the credibility of at least one known and recognizable attack method, we need to have one important consideration at the forefront of our minds, and it is this. However wanting Stephen Brearey and Ravi Jairam might be as human beings, what cannot be disputed is that they are men in the highest cohort in the population in intelligence and therefore resourcefulness and problem-solving ability. To make it to consultant status in the medical profession, you are by definition comfortably in the top 1% of the population in IQ. The idea that Evans's crackpot ideas were already a part of Operation Hummingbird, of the Operation Hummingbird PSYOP in February 2018 is not as revolutionary or fanciful as it might appear at first sight. The internet has been sanitized of information as to when Evans first joined the investigation, but in February 2018, the police investigation was already 9 months old. At the time I did my original deep dive into the Gateway Child F case, end of August 2023, I read somewhere that the police had got their own team of medical experts in on the investigation the previous July. That timing makes sense on a number of different levels when you stop to think about it. Presumably, that team must have included Evans, as no secret has been made of the fact that he was their number one pick. He himself has, on a number of occasions, boastfully said words to the effect that he saw foul play while still dunking the first biscuit in his tea, reading the very first case file. Is it conceivable that the more intelligent Brearey saw the potential problem down the road of convincing ordinary Brits on a jury to endorse a method of murder they had never before encountered, even in a science fiction film? Is it possible that, having chewed over this problem for a few months, he had a eureka moment in February 2018? A eureka of introducing into the case against Miss Letby a method which, though not common knowledge, was familiar in having been used to convict that male nurse about 15 years ago. All he would then have to do is dig through the thousands of cases of hyperglycemic episodes documented at the hospital 2015-2016 for one of suitable duration to get and hold the attention of jurors. I say thousands advisedly. Is it not the case that 40% of newborns experience an episode of insulin irregularity? The Countess of Chester had just over 30,000, actually well over 30,000 live births in both 2015 and 2016. Even if my memory is letting me down and Cheshire Police did not start putting together their team of medical experts before February 2018, there is that persistent rumour about Brearey and or Jairam attending the same conference in Wales as Evans just prior to the latter offering his services to the police. If that did happen, might Evans have advised of his go-to methods for such a challenge as convicting an innocent person? Might Brearey have seen the weakness of their unfamiliarity? Even in the, I now believe, highly improbable case that Brearey had never met Evans prior to February 2018, is it not possible that, as a highly intelligent man, actively engaged in a medical conspiracy he was then, he might not have identified the need for an accessible jump-off point for a future jury to begin its trip to the Alice in Wonderland alternate reality of a conviction? Okay, so that's what I had to say to you today. As usual, feel free to share your thoughts in the comment section below and any information you think might be of interest, as usual as well. Thank you for watching, thank you for your time, and all the best.